Well, good evening, everybody. How are you? Feeling good? Feeling great? Awesome. Welcome, everyone, to the Clinton Presidential Center Presents program, the first state visit. I'm Stephanie Semmes. I'm the Supervisory Museum Curator for the William J. Clinton Presidential Library and Museum. We recently opened a new temporary exhibit in early December entitled Be Our Guest. The exhibit explores 14 memorable diplomatic visits during the Clinton administration through rarely seen images and video, gifts given to the Clintons by world leaders, official correspondence, historical documents, and so much more. Tonight, we're going to learn about the first state visit when the King of Hawaii visited the White House during the Grant administration. Our presenter is Dr. Ryan P. Semmes, Director of Research for the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. In addition, Dr. Semmes will also share the history of the Grant Presidential Library. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize Dr. Annie Marshall, who's the Executive Director of the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library and the Ulysses S. Grant Association, and Eddie Rangel, our program coordinator for the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, who are also here with us this evening. Everybody, please focus up here. And we're excited for this new program. Thank you so much, Dr. Semmes.
Good evening. Well, thank you all for having me here this evening at the William Clinton Presidential Library. My name is Ryan Semmes. Again, I am the Director of Research at the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library at Mississippi State University in Starkville, Mississippi. And I'm happy to be here tonight to talk to you about the first state dinner, the first state visit when the King of Hawaii came to visit with Ulysses S. Grant. Okay, good. And also, we had a chance to go through the new exhibit here. And if you get a chance, you really should take a look. It is phenomenal. They have done excellent work. And you really get an idea of just how important the state visits were to the Clinton administration and to American and world history. And so I want to talk a little bit about that with you tonight to kind of talk about the precedent that was set for these types of state visits. Great. So what do we think of when we think of a state dinner or a state visit? I think of black tie and ball gowns and fancy dinners. Because I'm of a particular age, always think of John Travolta dancing with Princess Diana. Maybe some other folks of a different age think of Angela Lansbury dining with the Queen of England, which, if anything happened that night, she could solve the mystery. But we think of the fancy dinners and celebrity guests, and we think of all of Washington coming together in the United States on a world stage, right? And why is that? Because state dinners aren't just dinners. They are part of American diplomacy, and they're part and parcel to not only what the administration puts together, but what the State Department is putting together, because state dinners usually come along with some kind of important diplomatic reason, right? And we think also about etiquette when we think about state dinners. We think about seating charts. Not only where is the featured guest going to sit and their spouse, where is the president and their spouse going to sit, but also where are you going to put that one senator from the Defense Appropriations Committee who hates that other senator from the Defense Appropriations Committee, and they've got to be at separate ends of the room and they can't be at the same table? And what about that person's girlfriend because he used to date her and now she's married to him? And all of these things are very important. They are extremely important. And the White House staff has to go through all of these things, and they have to know those things. And in the old days, Washington, the Washington Post social section was probably the best place to find that information. But we also think about the protocol of how the event goes, who interacts with whom first, who says hello first, who walks forward first. Is there going to even be a military presence at the event? Sometimes that can be seen negatively depending on who's coming to visit to the White House. So where were these precedents set for the state dinner? I wouldn't be here otherwise, at the Ulysses S. Grant administration. This is President Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, First Lady Julia Dent Grant. Mrs. Grant grew up in St. Louis, the daughter of enslavers. Ulysses S. Grant grew up in Ohio, the son of abolitionists. So their marriage was off to a rocky start pretty early on, but not their personal marriage. They were actually quite in love with one another. It's just that both of their fathers hated one another. But anyway, that's a whole other story. But Mrs. Grant, though, grew up in finery, right? She grew up, or at least in some semblance of finery compared to her husband. And so when she got to the White House after a few years of living in hardscrabble, their cabin in St. Louis, or living in tents throughout the Civil War, Mrs. Grant was really happy to be in the White House, where she had this beautiful home and servants and could host dinner parties and could host a number of different events. And Grant could care less about any of it, probably. But she was able to kind of clean up the White House after the Johnson administration, which both figuratively and literally. And the White House became a place where people would come and enjoy themselves again during the Grant administration. So again, state dinners are not just about finery and fine living, they're about diplomacy often. And who was the chief diplomat of the Grant administration? He was Secretary of State Hamilton Fish. Hamilton Fish was a New Yorker, former governor of New York, former member of Congress from New York, named Hamilton because his father was good friends with Alexander Hamilton. So he's an old school New York, going back to the Revolutionary and pre-Revolutionary time. And Hamilton Fish is one of the members of Grant's cabinet who stays for all 8 years. He's the dean of the cabinet. He is the number 1 person in the cabinet. He tries to resign every single year, and Grant talks him out of it every single year, and that's fun. But thankfully for America, he stays. Why? Because there are actually important diplomatic things happening during the Grant administration. When we think of the Grant administration, we think of Reconstruction, and that is one of the most important periods, if not the most important period in American history. I'll throw that out there. In this period following the Civil War, because it's this period when the United States is reorganizing itself around new constitutional principles. But at the same time, the United States is a part of the world, and the Secretary of State leads the United States through these issues in the world, which include things like the Alabama claims, which were issues that we had with with Great Britain, through the annexation of the Dominican Republic attempt, where Grant wants to make the Dominican Republic a state. The 10 Years' War, which is a rebellion that's happening in Cuba, where the enslaved and farmers and some of their former enslavers have all come together because they're Cubans to kick the Spanish out of the colony, right? All these things are happening on the doorstep of the United States. And in the middle of all of this is the Grant administration. And one of the things that's most important to the Grant administration, because of all this stuff that's going on in the Caribbean, is the development of reciprocity treaties with territories in the Pacific. Because in that point in the United States history, we have outlawed slavery. But slavery is not, it still exists in the Western Hemisphere, and in particular, it exists in Cuba. And where does the United States get almost all of it, or the large majority of its tropical goods, particularly sugar? They get it from Cuba. And Grant says we cannot call ourselves an enlightened society if we're still, the #1 supplier of enslavement in this hemisphere, because we purchase the goods that slaves produce. So he's looking for new places and new territories. And one of those great places that he's looking for is Hawaii, because Hawaii produces not only good tropical goods, but they also produce sugar. So while this is the first state visit, it's not the first state dinner. And the reason why we say that is state dinners were held in administrations all throughout. They usually were held for ambassadors who were coming to Washington. right? They were people, the state dinner, because the State Department would hold a dinner for diplomats and but they weren't heads of state. They were usually, the minister from Great Britain or Canada or wherever. And they would hold these dinners, Grant would, where he would invite all of the political leaders that he liked. So he would invite all the Republican political leaders to the White House to have dinners with all of these ministers and diplomats and such, right? And he would bring the Supreme Court in and naval officers and army officers and stuff. And that's what a traditional state dinner is. But those things can happen a little more regularly with a little less pomp and circumstance. But a head of state coming requires a bit more protocol. And so they look to European protocols to decide, how are we going to work with this visit from the new king of Hawaii, King Kalākaua. King Kalākaua, this is his name. His name is David Kalākaua. I won't say his full name because I can't, and I wouldn't be so rude as to try. David Kalākaua was elected King of Hawaii in February of 1874. And again, his first visit, I'll go back to the last slide, is not the first even leader of a people or a nation to come. As you see here, there's a delegation of Navajo leaders who came to the White House just days before King Kalākaua came. There are several leaders of the Sioux, Lakota, the Cheyenne, all these folks, Native American leaders come to the United States during the Grant administration. They are given receptions, large parties for them, but they are not treated as heads of state, because during the Grant administration is when the United States stopped treating with Native American nations as foreign nations and treated them as wards of the United States. So they aren't treated as such. But King Kalākaua he is elected king in February 12th, 1874. And he had already communicated with Grant even prior to that, because he would communicate on behalf of the previous king, King Lunalilo. But he decides he wants to go to the United States because he wants to make a good impression of Hawaii for this reciprocal trade treaty. Why? Because in previous years, the United States had actually worked out reciprocal trade treaties with Hawaii, with King Lunalilo, previous to that, King Kamehameha V, and every time the Senate had voted it down. And so the King of Hawaii and the Grant administration all realized that this visit can be really helpful if the King of Hawaii can actually meet with these members, these United States senators. And then maybe they'll have a personal connection. They'll understand why the Grant administration wants to sign this treaty of trade, and then, things will go forward pretty well. So he leaves Hawaii on November 18th, 1874, and this is the first of 3 trips that he makes to the United States, the king. It takes about 10 days to get from Hawaii to San Francisco. And when he arrives on November 28th, 1874, he becomes the first, quote, reigning monarch to ever set foot on American soil, according to historian Douglas Askman. He stays at the Grand Hotel on Market Street. I don't know if anyone knows San Francisco history, but there you go. And he tells the reporters and the crowds who come out to meet him that the purpose of his visit is to improve trade relations. So he's very obvious about why he's there. He's not pretending he's on some sightseeing mission. While he's in San Francisco, he does what everyone does when they go to San Francisco. He went to Alcatraz. Alcatraz was a fort at the time, and of course now it's a national site. But he visited Fort Alcatraz, and he went to plays, and he went to parties, and he went out to eat at fancy dinners, again, just like anyone does in San Francisco. But he's not there to hang out in San Francisco. He'd been to San Francisco before as a young man. He's there to see the rest of the United States. So he boards a train. On December 8th, he goes to Wyoming, and they spend he spends a day there in both Laramie and Cheyenne, meeting people, seeing, what they're doing and how these towns like Laramie and Cheyenne are growing and getting bigger, and little receptions are held for him. And then he continues on the next day to Nebraska. And about the time he's in Nebraska, he gets really sick. to the point he catches a cold. I mean, this is December now in Nebraska. It's pretty cold. But he starts to lose his voice. But the problem is they're having all these events where he's supposed to make speeches and things. And in particular, he's going to the White House. And so he starts canceling events because he has to rest his voice. He gets to Chicago, and on December 10th, this is the same day that Grant is welcoming the Navajo chiefs to the White House. And on December 10th, he tells the people in Chicago, that it's great and all, but I can't stay. I got to keep moving because I can't speak. Or he has other people say that for him because he can't talk. And he rests his voice. He gets to Pittsburgh. He does one of those whistle stop, whispers from the back of the train in Pittsburgh on December 11th. And this is when the next day is when he makes it to the DC area. And this is when protocol begins. He makes it to Washington, D.C., first in Baltimore. And as the train is coming down from Baltimore to Washington, it's stopped by a special train car that the Grant administration has set up for him. On that train car is Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, a number of members of the cabinet, and a few White House officials, but not President Grant. Protocol says Grant should have been there to meet him at the train. But those of us who know Grant and learn about Grant know that protocol isn't always something that he cares necessarily about, except for military protocol. Grant doesn't make it. He has other things that he's doing that day. He can't make it. So he sends Hamilton Fish. They arrive at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, which you can see here. Used to be on the corner of 6th and B or Pennsylvania Avenue. Right now it's where the National Gallery of Art is, if you've ever been. Fun fact, this is the site of James Garfield's assassination. I guess that's not too fun for James Garfield, but this is where James Garfield is shot. And I just learned today they're making a mini series about that, so yay, on Netflix. This depot, though, and the train were adorned with flags of Hawaii, flags of the United States. And when the King and Secretary Fish walk out of the depot onto Pennsylvania Avenue, there's an entire battalion of U.S. Marines. The president's own Marine band is there. They're playing the Hawaiian national anthem, which his sister has written. And they get into the president's carriage, which is, again, bunting, Hawaiian flags, and they make their way all the way up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Arlington Hotel. The Arlington Hotel is no longer there, unfortunately, but the Arlington Hotel is jam-packed with people. Let's see. Here's the Arlington Hotel. When he gets there, he is given the entire first floor. Every single room is given over to him, the proprietor of the hotel, and it's a relatively new hotel at this time. He's so happy that the king has chosen the Arlington Hotel to stay. But the king, again, is still feeling a little bit under the weather, and he says, "Look, I need a couple days to recuperate before we start the back and forth." And Hamilton Fish says, "Okay, we'll get things together, but the next move, you need to come and visit the White House and call upon the president, but you need to let us know ahead of time." So while he's at the Arlington Hotel, a number of people come to see him. And again, they have quiet conversations with him as he's trying to recuperate. And he gets a lot of invitations to dinner. And one of those invitations is to dinner with a man named, Sidney McFarland. Sidney McFarland is a grocer. He is an African-American man who in the time since the Civil War has opened up a grocery store in Washington, D.C. And he and a number of African-American men in Washington, D.C. have taken it upon themselves to invite the king to dinner at his home. The king, unfortunately, has to say no, but it's an important enough and a significant enough event that it's reported in newspapers all around D.C. Because here we are in the Reconstruction era where men of color are inviting a head of state, a king, who is himself a person of color, to their home for dinner with the expectation that there was nothing wrong or untoward about this. This is something that would not have necessarily been okay in Washington, D.C. just a few years prior. But it's such a significant event that, again, all the newspapers report on it. And I just think it's a really interesting thing because, again, the Grant administration and Grant's White House is one of the first who welcomes so many different people of color into the White House for receptions and meetings and dinners and things. Not happened before, and it will be a few more administrations afterwards before it becomes the norm. So the Grant White House is a White House where there are kind of revolutionary and radical things that are happening, not only in terms of his politics, but also in terms of the social aspect of who he's interacting with in the White House. So on December 15th, 1874, the king is finally feeling a little bit better. He's been there for about 3 years, and he decides it's time to go and be received at the White House. So he and a group of his men, the suite of men with him, go to the White House. They're welcomed at the portico on the outside and then walked through the main lobby with President Grant, Secretary of State, and a bunch of other guys. And they're welcomed into the Blue Room. The Blue Room, here you can see a photograph of the Blue Room from 1874. So this photograph was taken, probably just a few weeks before King Kalākaua came to the White House. And of course, this is the Blue Room during the Clinton White House. I love it because even though we know that the White House was taken down to the studs a few times and brought back, the footprint of the Blue Room is still there. You can still see the fireplace. This picture is taken pretty much from the same angle. You can see the window. It's just that now, during the Clinton White House and the years prior to that, somebody has cut a doorway or a walkway through the wall there, leading to the Red Room or one of the other rooms there. So in the Blue Room, this first reception with King Kalākaua and President Grant lasts about 20 minutes. Not because anything wrong, that was just protocol. It wasn't supposed to be anything other than a 15, 20-minute meeting. The two sat on that circular chair in the center of the room where they talked about his visit, where he'd been so far, how he was feeling, if he was up to any more meetings. And then they talked about the reciprocity treaty a little bit. All around the room are the Secretary of State, the minister from Hawaii, the minister to Hawaii, who are doing their diplomacy in, not in the corner, it's around the room, but around the room, and then getting pulled into the center of the room when either the king or the president has a question. 20 minutes later, the king rises, says he looks forward to seeing Grant again. Grant says, "We'll call upon you at your hotel," which is the next step in protocol. And the next day, on December 16th, they return to the Arlington Hotel. This time Grant is with Hamilton Fish, the Secretary of State. All the members of the cabinet and General Sherman is there. And again, protocol says it is a short visit. So they have another 15, 20-minute visit. It is pretty much a mirror image of the visit in the White House. Again, they sit in the middle of the room. They talk about a few things. But one of the things Grant says is, before we have this dinner, I want to have a large reception where all of Washington can come out and to the White House and meet you. And he says, "Sure, that sounds great." And Grant says, "No, I mean like 500 people." And the king of Hawaii agrees. And then 20 minutes later, they leave again. Later that day, Hamilton Fish goes back to his office and he finds the Sir Edward Thornton, who is the British minister to the United States. He's a good guy, and he and Fish have a good reputation and a good relationship, I should say. And Sir Edward Thornton starts giving his Monday morning quarterbacking of how things are going protocol-wise, and he really wags his finger at Fish about Grant not meeting the King of Hawaii at the railroad head, to which Hamilton Fish just shrugs his shoulders and says, "Oh, well, it didn't happen that way, so we're just going to move on." But in the end, in his British way, Thornton says, "But I mean, it seems to be a pretty lovely visit so far, so sure." The next day, the king returns to the White House, and this is an important event. This is a second receiving of him at the White House, again, for another 20, 30-minute visit, but it's to meet Mrs. Grant and the ladies of the cabinet. And again, this is a head of state of a nation of people of color who's being invited to meet and have possibly a drink with the First Lady of the United States and all of the ladies of the cabinet. And this is an important moment, I think, in this visit, because from all of the events from that point forward, the King of Hawaii will be escorting Mrs. Grant to different events and to the table and things like that. He did not bring his wife with him, so he's alone. And well, he's got like his brother-in-law and a bunch of guys with him. But he gets the honor to seat Mrs. Grant. This is an important thing for the Grant administration and is radical, and in some newspapers is seen as abhorrent. Later that day, after they meet with Mrs. Grant, they go to the opera, where the king is given his own box, which again covered with the flag of Hawaii, and they see an opera put on by an opera singer named Miss Clara Louise Kellogg. She's a pretty important opera singer from the time. She's from Georgia, and after it's over with, the king and the president go down to the stage and present her with flowers. So again, now we are seeing him in a very public setting, this man of color doing things that leaders of color were not really allowed to be doing. Not only being in the theater at all and in a box, but being welcomed onto the stage and presenting flowers to the featured singer. These are all important moments in American history. They're small moments, but they're important because they normalize this notion of racial equality that wasn't happening in the years prior to the Grant administration. There are two firsts here. Not only is he the first head of state to visit the White House, he is also the first head of state to speak to a joint session of Congress. I say speak, again, his voice is a little rough. On December 18th, he heads to the United States Senate chamber, where he watches senators do what senators do, which is argue about the ticking clock, because December is usually when Congress would convene, and they had a few things they wanted to get to before they went over to listen to his speech. He's then taken over to the House chamber, where they convene a joint session of Congress, where the Speaker of the House gives a speech in his honor, and he has a speech that he has written, the king, that he wants to give, but again, his voice just, it can't get the back of the room. So he has his colleague, who is Judge Elijah Allen, who is the Hawaiian minister to the United States, but he is also the Chief Justice of the Hawaiian Supreme Court, read the speech for him. You can see the text of the speech here on the slide. One of the interesting things about it, if you notice, the King of Hawaii in the second paragraph is pointing out that Hawaii looks to the United States as an example, not only in government, but in civilization. He is a king who is trying to move Hawaii to a more Western sensibility. You see it in the way that he dresses. He wears a uniform. You see it in the development of their governmental functions. He's trying to move Hawaii away from their traditional culture. This is something the Grant administration approves of. They're all for racial equality, so long as they are, it's a racial equality based out of a notion of Western civilization. He's not interested in Native American culture. He's really not interested in Hawaiian culture. He's interested in Hawaii as a modern democratic monarchy. Another fun fact about the guy that gives his speech, Elijah Allen, one of only 10 people to die in the White House. All of my fun facts are about death. Apparently, he dies. He's at a New Year's Eve party during the Arthur administration, and he starts feeling bad, and he goes upstairs, lies on a bed, has a heart attack, and dies. So, you know, again, a lot of people, a lot of death around the White House. So that same day that he goes to the joint session of Congress, he returns to the White House, and that's when we have the reception with over 500 guests. And the reason why is because the state dinner is going to be a small affair, but Grant wants, you know, all of the members of the Supreme Court and the heads, you know, all of the different members of Congress, political leaders, Army and Navy leaders and stuff, to be able to come and meet the King of Hawaii. So Hamilton Fish writes in his diary that about the reception, and he mentions the people who are there, which is all the folks from the diplomatic corps. I like that he calls the Supreme Court the Supreme. One S away, it would have made it funnier. District court officers, Army and Navy and such. And then he talks about going into the Blue Room, and the king is talking to Mrs. Grant and a number of the wives of the cabinet members. And then Mrs. Grant and all the cabinet members get ice cold. And it's because one of the cabinet members' wives, Kate Williams, has walked into the room, and they all like literally turn their backs on her and shun her. And I have to think the King of Hawaii has no clue any of this is happening, but Hamilton Fish is paying close attention and he's aware. Kate Williams is the wife of the Attorney General, George Williams. She's his second wife. His first wife was also named Kate, which is weird. So Kate too is there, and she rides around town in a brand new carriage and flaunts it to everybody. And all of the women in the cabinet and Mrs. Grant are like, that's just, it's tacky, and he doesn't make enough money. Where are they getting that money? Well, we find out about a month and a half later that money's coming from the Justice Department, because he has commingled all of his personal accounts with the accounts of the Justice Department, and they are fancying up their house and buying fancy carriages and spending money on things using federal dollars. And within a few months in 1875, Attorney General Williams has resigned. So in the middle of all of this, again, there are these little plays, these little dramas that are going on in the room that, again, the King of Hawaii is probably unaware of. He's given a few days off, which I'm sure he appreciated, even though still then a bunch of well-wishers come and see him. But he hangs out in the hotel for about 3 or 4 days. And then on December 22nd, 1874, the king is welcomed to the White House for the first official state dinner. This state dinner had the king and his suite of folks. Let me go ahead. Oops. We'll go back. Well, we'll see a picture of the king and the folks in a few minutes that comes from our collection. But it was the King of Hawaii. It was his brother-in-law, John Dominus, the governor of Oahu, who was also the husband of the last queen of Hawaii until the United States overthrew her and threw her in jail, and we did terrible things. That's a whole other story as well. J.M. Kapena, the governor of Maui, Luther Severance, who was a former U.S. commissioner to Hawaii, and then Elisha Allen, the Supreme Court justice who spoke for him. Also there, obviously, are President Grant and Mrs. Grant, Hamilton Fish and his wife, the British minister and his wife, all of the, the vice president, the Speaker of the House, all of the secretaries from the cabinet and their wives, including Attorney General Williams and his wife. Again, I'm not quite sure where she sat, but wherever it was, she was probably not involved in the conversation too much. What was happening at the White House during this state dinner? Well, the Evening Star had a reporter there, and thankfully they've reported that for us on December 23rd, 1874. They said the suite of drawing rooms, including the magnificent East Room, were brilliantly illuminated with soft light from the crystal chandeliers, which gave an added beauty to the furniture and all the pictures. And in each room, there was a fine display of flowers. And of course, the most elaborate floral decorations were those in the dining room. This is a picture of the actual dining room from 1874. And the Evening Star reports on, and you can see that in the center of the table, there was a long mirror. And on top of that mirror was these arches and vines. And there was a setting known as an épergne. This is where some of these French words get me. An épergne. This is an épergne here. I chose this one because it has a pineapple on it, which made me think of Hawaii and welcoming. But épergnes all throughout, all on the table, right? And they were full of flowers and fruits and candies and all sorts of things that were there. And they were, as the newspaper said, flowers and bonbons. There were glosses and confections and pyramids, and there were plates for 30 persons. There were glasses for sherry and claret and champagne and goblets of water. There's a lot of discussion about Grant and his drinking, and we can get into why those rumors are unfounded. But this was not a dry White House. That guests were offered alcoholic drinks, but that doesn't mean that Grant over partook in them. And I'm happy to talk about that in questions and answers later. The China, the newspaper reports, was an elegant service of pink and white. You can see it on the slide here, the plate and the cup that we have. We have this in our collections at the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library. This was one of multiple sets of White House china. It's not the official White House china. It's the set that they purchased for their daughter Nellie's White House wedding. So we have this in our collections. It's very nice. You could see why they would pull it out for such an occasion. And on each plate, there was a nice square card where each card had been engraved with a picture of the White House, and then in calligraphy, they had written the name of the person seated in that chair. There were only 36 people at the dinner. There were 30 plus courses, so they had to take breaks. As you can imagine, they took breaks, and in the breaks in between, they would drink glasses of water or they would drink coffee, and the Marine band would play music for them in between. What was the menu? There were several choices of soup and fish, boiled meats and roasted meats. And if it was Grant, it was really roasted meat because Grant liked all of his beef, at the very least, well done. There were game entrees, vegetables, relishes, and then for dessert, lots of pastries and other kinds of desserts. One of the reasons why the menu was so fine is that Mrs. Grant had hired an Italian chef to be the White House chef. In the first few years of the White House, they had just used an old Army quartermaster cook who Grant knew from the war because he knew how charred Grant liked his meat. And people would come to the dinner and, kind of hack their way through it. And Mrs. Grant finally went, no. We're hiring someone who knows what they're doing. I'm sure his name was Cookie or something like that. But, during this dinner, as again, the king is seated next to Mrs. Grant, as each course comes out, his official food taster tries the course before he tries it, which I think is still very interesting. After the event, it goes pretty late into the evening. The king returns to the Arlington Hotel, and he kind of holds court in the hotel with all of the journalists who are around. And really, I think after an all night of eating and drinking, he was feeling pretty good about himself. And despite his voice being bad, he talked a lot about his athletic prowess. Apparently, just at that time in the United States, an American had set an American record for cliff diving. And the king laughed at how low it was and said that children in Hawaii dive from higher points than that. And he said he was welcome to come back in 1876. He was looking forward to coming back during the centennial because he wanted to compete as an oarsman for the country of Hawaii in rowing events. He unfortunately did not make it back for 1876, but he did come back in 1881. So the next day, the king, and again, this is the king and his suite of fellows. Again, this is his son-in-law his brother-in-law, on the far left, the two ambassadors behind him, and the governor of Maui to his left. And then this is a royal portrait that he had made while he was in the United States. So the king leaves, and he's met at the hotel, not by the president again, but by the Secretary of State. The president is done now and ready to let him go. But while he leaves, the governor, his brother-in-law, stays behind to negotiate the reciprocity treaty. And while he negotiates this treaty, he is able to, they're able to work it out where the United States will import sugar from Hawaii and export American goods, and they'll do it all duty-free. And they actually are able to get this to pass the United States Senate. So the diplomacy, the soft diplomacy worked. It passes the United States Senate, and the Reciprocity Treaty passes in February of '75, and then it is ratified in March of 1875. Grant sends it to the Senate, I should say, in February, and it's ratified in March of 1875. And the reason why they're doing this, again, is to undercut the use and the importation of goods from the Caribbean. Just in terms of numbers, federal government allocated $50,000 for this event. It's a lot of money in our time, but they felt that it was $50,000 well spent. So most of the newspapers that covered the event were very positive. Even some anti-Grant newspapers were quite positive, but there was a significant anti-Grant press. And one of the loudest, because it was an illustrated press, was Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper. And Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper covered this through racist and horrible stereotypes. But they also hate Grant, so they use these racist stereotypes to undercut any messaging coming from the Grant White House. And you have to understand that at the same time that he's welcoming the Navajo, and then a few days later, the King of Hawaii, Grant is also sending forces to Mississippi, not sending them to Louisiana, working to pass a civil rights bill in Congress, and dealing with violence against Native Americans. All these things are happening at the same time, and then he has to go to dinner, right? and meet the king and listen to music all night. So all of this is happening, and so there's still intense racial violence and animosity happening in this country. And so you see it in the pages of an illustrated newspaper like Frank Leslie's, where they not only are trying to undermine the Grant administration, they undermine the king's visit and the king's people at the same time. So two of the worst are unfortunately, but I wanted to show them, Trying It On depicts Grant on the throne, surrounded by his cabinet members and stereotypical Native people from both the Caribbean and Hawaii. If you notice, Grant is wearing the uniform of the King of Hawaii, right? Because Frank Leslie's and a number of these newspapers, they thought Grant was trying to make himself the new Caesar. They believed he wanted to be an emperor, the king of the United States. That when his second term was up, he wasn't going to follow conventions like Washington, and he was going to run for a third term. And then he was just going to name himself emperor like Caesar or Napoleon. So they envisioned him as a king here. And if you also notice, you can see that the Native women are presenting Cuba to him, because Frank Leslie's believed that not only did Grant want to end slavery in Cuba, they believe he wanted to take Cuba, and he'd take Haiti and then take the Dominican Republic, and as part of his imperial vision for the United States and his kingdom. The royal tattoo here shows King Kalākaua tattooing President Grant. The tattoos that are going on him, you have to kind of zoom in, but they're kind of really inside baseball 1870s politics stuff. If you see, Grant is dressed as a stereotypical Pacific Islander with a crown on and a scepter, but essentially what they're saying is, okay, if we can't make him a Western king, at least he can make himself a king of the Pacific. Also note the box of sugar on the table, right? All of this is really, when it boils down to it, this is all just about sugar. And Americans like sugar even in the 1870s. If you can see, it's kind of hard to see, but underneath where the king is tattooing Grant, he says, "Keep still, General, this is delicate work, and there's hardly room to get all of it in. Your people won't have you for an emperor, but I'll make a king of you after our own fashion." So again, these political cartoons are meant to convey a particular point of view, not only of the Grant administration, but of racial equality. So what is the legacy of the state dinner? Well, there have been over 300 state dinners since 1874. And again, I recommend you go to the exhibit here at the Clinton Presidential Library and see some really great material on the state visits and personal visits and state dinners that occurred here. President Reagan hosted 59 state dinners. That's the most. That's a lot. But one of the things it did is it changed as the presidency moves into the 20th century. It changes the roles of the staff of the White House, right? Again, Grant just thought an army cook would do. No, you have to have a personal chef. And you get to the 20th century, you have to have social secretaries, florists on call, ushers, music directors. All of these things are required and responsible to get through a state visit. State visits often are for diplomatic triumphs as much as they're for diplomatic negotiations. And fashion now is an important thing. The dress that the First Lady is wearing or the Vice President is wearing at the state dinner is important for that designer. Now in the age of social media, who gets to come to the event, celebrities and things, all are important to the way the United States puts forward its face to the world. And then inevitably, with that much intense looking at a state dinner, there will be breaches in etiquette and faux pas, which I'm sure there were plenty at the Grant administration. I'd love to tell you more about what happens to the king later on, and if anyone has a question, I'll happily answer. But I want to quickly go into what we do at the Grant Presidential Library to close things up. The Ulysses S. Grant Association was founded in 1962, and our sole purpose was the publication of the papers in the written works of Ulysses S. Grant. It was founded originally at Ohio State University, then moved to Southern Illinois, Carbondale, where it was executive directed and managed by a man named Dr. John Y. Simon. Dr. Simon he thought he would publish 17 volumes of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant. We ended up with 32 volumes of the papers of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was a quiet man, but so people assumed he didn't write anything. But I mean, he was a general and a president. So, I mean, come on. He wrote a lot. That collection moved to Mississippi State in 2008 following the death of Dr. Simon. When Dr. Simon died, the staff had grown to a pretty small staff, and they were looking for a Civil War historian who could lead the project into the future. And they chose Mississippi State University because Dr. John Marszalek agreed to be the new executive director. He agreed to kind of shepherd the project as it went through. But we also said that we would make the material available to the public because the entire collection had been only for the use of the historians who were publishing those books and was not publicly available. We have over 17,000 linear feet of documents. We have over 15,000 volumes of books, thousands and thousands of artifacts and original manuscripts that have been donated from the family members of the Grants and their different branches of the family. And we have now made that material available. And in 2012, we realized that we had the most comprehensive collection of Ulysses S. Grant research materials of anywhere in the country. And we named ourselves the Ulysses S. Grant Presidential Library, because if you're a 19th century president, you can do that. We're not bound by the National Archives or Congress or any of those things. So in 2012, we became the Grant Presidential Library, and in 2017, we opened a 21,000 square foot addition on the campus library at Mississippi State University, Mitchell Memorial Library. That 21,000 square feet is where we are now, but it is just the beginning of where we're going. We have a large museum space. We also have a dedicated space to a collection of Abraham Lincoln memorabilia and artifacts and documents. But we are moving on to the future. So we are currently on the roof and the fourth floor of the existing campus library. We will be moving to a space adjacent to campus. If you're not from Starkville, I'm sure this is meaningless, I'm sorry. But trust me, that's a big lot of land and people in Starkville know where it is. And the good thing about it is it's right in the prime spot. It's at the opening of campus, right when you come to town. And we had hoped to have a design drawing by now, but it's gonna be about a month or so. So look out for that in the future. One of the reasons why we're happy to be here is because we wanna see what a first-class presidential library does. meet first-class presidential library staff and volunteers and really get a look at what you guys are able to do here, and then figure out how we can do that with, I don't know, 200th of the budget. But there's something that we could do together and get some ideas. And we're just really happy to be here. And I'm happy to answer any questions. And this is all of our social media stuff. But if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
If you have a question, a volunteer will bring you a microphone, and we ask that you stand up and ask your question. Any questions? I see one in the front.
Hi.
Hi.
Regarding the library, you said it's on the top floor of an existing building, so it's
Yes.
not, it's not the building itself, in other words.
Correct.
just that-
We are on the 4th floor of the campus library, which is the Mitchell Memorial Library. And a few years ago was really, well, here's what I'll say. When we first opened, and then this is for us, we have about 9,000 visitors a year, which for us is pretty good, particularly in the middle of a campus on the top floor of a library. And then COVID hit, and our numbers, essentially went down to 0 for a year or so. And then we kicked back open, and they're eking back up. But in the middle of that, the campus changed, and they put all these gates up, and now to make it a bit more accessible for, I think, faculty and staff, but to make it a walking campus for the students. And I understand some of the reasoning behind some of it, but the campus library is in the dead center of campus, and now it is almost impossible for school groups and senior citizens groups and things to get to us. So one of the positive reasons for us building a freestanding facility on the edge of campus and on the edge of town is that we're going to be open and available to school groups, to senior citizen groups, to political community groups and events like this all day and night, no matter what. So right now we're up on the top floor of the library. And I think we do a pretty good job with what we have and where we are. But it's in stages, right? We did a great job when we were in the basement and had a tiny little room as big as this stage, to showcase things. Now we have 1,000 square foot gallery space, but we want to have a bigger, and we want to have a gallery space where we can do wonderful things like Be Our Guest, where we can showcase temporary exhibits and change them out. And all of that is part of an ongoing process that we're hoping that has already gotten started, and we're hoping to be able to start showcasing some things for it, in the coming year.
Dr. Semmes, I'm
Yes.
so happy I came tonight. I drove about 60 miles to be here.
Oh, thank you.
And I lived in Hawaii, and there is an effort in Hawaii among Native indigenous people to restore the kingdom of Hawaii. And obviously this is not going to happen because while colonization is, decolonization is happening around the world, I don't think the United States is ever going to give up Hawaii back to the Hawaiian people. And if they did, China might take it away. But where was President Grant during this time? Because I'm not quite sure when the kingdom was overthrown. Was President Grant alive at that time? Thank you.
So during the Grant administration, there are attempts, quiet attempts, to annex Hawaii. Elisha Allen and Governor Dominus are writing to the Secretary of State and discussing not only the reciprocity treaty, but a possibility of annexation as a territory, and then territories have a path towards statehood. Grant's focus at that point in terms of annexing new territories is either in the West or in the Caribbean. But that doesn't mean that he's not interested in new territories in the Pacific. Obviously, they end up annexing Guam. So it is in a discussion at the time. The King Kalākaua dies in the late 1880s, early 1890s, which is when Lily Kalani becomes queen, and it's in the 1890s when she is overthrown. Grant dies in 1885, so he's been dead for a few years when that happens. He's been out of office. He did want a third term, but didn't get it. But at that point, I think Grant was one of these guys, like he even thought Canada would become a part of the United States, but he always wanted it to come from the people, is what he would say. And you could argue whether the Dominicans actually wanted to become part of the United States, but in his mind they did. And they asked about it, so he was for it. And then people would say, let's take Canada. And he would say, well, we need to hear it from the Canadians first. So I think the same with annexation from the Hawaiians. He would want to hear it from the Hawaiians first. And what he's hearing from the king, the new king of Hawaii, is not annexation, but a reciprocal agreement where they can work together on trade. So, hi.
Having grown up in the Deep South and studied Civil War history in school, I find it very interesting that the Jefferson Davis Library is also in Mississippi. Do you all work together at all, or was there any kind of feedback about having Grant's library in Mississippi?
Well, I'll take the second part first. I would say 99.9% of the feedback has been very positive about the Grant Library being in Mississippi. One of the things that I like to focus on about the Grant Presidential Library is that he is president during Reconstruction, and one of the epicenters of Reconstruction is the state of Mississippi, right? It's one of the more important states. Obviously, Louisiana, South Carolina, there are important things happening, but just as important in Mississippi. And so if you want to go and study Reconstruction, you have to also study the Grant administration, and doing that in the state where these things are happening is, I think, important. But also it's just important because we're a modern land grant institution at Mississippi State University, and it's our job to, as a people's university, to provide a well-rounded education and to provide, insight into these historical events. And I think the Grant administration, I think Grant would, appreciate a land grant college. We were an old military college fashioned after West Point. He would have got a kick out of that. In terms of the Jefferson Davis Library, in the past, we have had some conversations with them, but I know that there's been some change in leadership there, and we haven't had a lot of connection with them in recent years. But yes, there's a lot of curiosity about the Grant Library being in Mississippi, but I like to think, our university president likes to think that no state did more for Grant's career than Mississippi when he took the city of Vicksburg. So.
Two quick questions. One, are you any relation to Captain Raphael Semmes? And two, do you plan on scheduling another grant symposium this summer?
Okay, again, the second, yes, we will be having a grant, our annual Grant Association meeting in St. Louis, first week of May. And it will be in conjunction with the folks at Whitehaven, which is the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site, which Whitehaven, it was his wife Julia's family home, where he had farmed and didn't do such a great job as a farmer, and built a little cabin for them there. So the National Historic Site in St. Louis. The first part, we are part of the same family, myself and Raphael Semmes, the Confederate raider of the Alabama and the bane of Grant's Secretary of State's existence. Yeah, we're the same family. He and my great whatever had the same grandfather. So I don't know I don't know how to do that genealogy, but I know that, we're not direct line. So yeah.
Well, hello, hi. Thank you very much. I enjoyed your lecture very much. I find it interesting that the king had a problem speaking, and sadly, so did the general at the end of his days. But one was terminal because of the cancer and hesitancy for treatment and all. The president's health, I know he had a back problem because of a horse fall.
In New Orleans, right?
Do you, in your collection, does he speak about his health and his relationships to his physicians?
He speaks about his health a lot. He writes about his health a lot, particularly during the Civil War. He he tries every remedy he can. He has these horrible migraines, which I think are just anxiety migraines and depression migraines, because he has, on the day of Appomattox, he has a terrible migraine. And then when he finds out Lee is surrendering, all of a sudden that migraine goes away, right? And he tries a lot of, what was it, mustard? He puts mustard all over bandages and wraps his head in mustard bandages and things. So he talks a lot about his health. Obviously, in his dying days, he does talk a lot. He writes a lot about his health in his dying days, obviously, because he can't speak. He had throat and mouth cancer from all the cigars that he smoked. A lot of cigars, that hyperbolically, we say 20 something a day, but it was still a lot of cigars. It wasn't that much, but it was still too many. Too many cigars. Don't smoke. But we have a lot of information from his physicians, right? It's not quite a 24-hour news cycle, but you have reports in every morning newspaper in New York and every evening newspaper in New York. So you're getting 2 newspaper reports per day of reporters interviewing all of his physicians talking about his health. And then, an old Confederate foe, like Simon Buckner, comes to see him and then comes out and speaks to the press and speaks very eloquently about what a loss this will be for our nation and things like that. So there is a constant stream of conversation and interviews with his physicians, and we have records of that in our collection. His actual tumor is at the National Museum of Health. They still have it. They've cut it, it's all on slides now, but they still have his cancerous tumor because they were trying all these new methods, right, of treatment during that time period. Our Department of History head, Alan Marcus, knows a lot more about the history of cancer, so I'm not going to wade into things I don't know, and he'll tell me. But yeah, he's constantly talking about, but they're all of these men and women during this time period are constantly remarking on their health. We have so many journals or diaries. His private secretary during the White House years was his aide de camp also in the latter years of the Civil War. And in almost every entry, he has a paragraph about his health that day and how he's feeling. But that's because you could die from anything back then. I mean, the guy gets dysentery. His name's Orville Babcock. He gets dysentery at Vicksburg and has to go for treatment. He leaves the army for a little while and goes up to the Great Lakes for treatment. But every day he's writing about his health because he's concerned, because anything could get you back then, So there's so much written about medicine and health and concerns about their lives, all throughout their personal correspondence and their diaries and in newspaper articles. So yeah, there's a lot of really great stuff out there.
A single health issue that impacted his decision making, his decision, even in New Orleans, in regards to race,
as I am not a military historian, the question was, is there any health issues that he has that may have impacted some of his decision making, particularly in New Orleans when he, I think, fell off a horse and hurt his back or something. Yeah, I'm more of the presidency guy, and I don't want to weigh in on any of his military decision making. I could say that there's nothing that I have seen about his health or any physical ailments that impacted any decision making during his presidency. But I don't want to speak about the war because I don't know enough about it to just start making things. I can make things up, but I don't want to do that. Sure.
Say a few. Good evening. I want to thank everyone for coming. I am Kathleen Pate. I'm the education specialist here at the Clinton Presidential Library, and I'm so appreciative. Ryan, I reached out to the Grant Presidential Library when I found out that it was the first state visit, and he responded immediately. We had some great phone calls. So delighted to have him here along with Ann and Eddie and Ryan's wife. I want to thank everyone for coming out, especially the folks who are joining us virtually because I know that we have several volunteers from other presidential libraries who have joined us. And I think that's all of my notes. And just know, when you guys are ready, we want to come see your new facility. We'll get a bus, we'll drive down there. Our volunteers have an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. So we will come and see. I've been to the current facility. It's absolutely worth a trip. I got to go before they shut campus down. I was there in December of 2019, so you could still drive and park. But I encourage folks to go now, and certainly we want to go when you have your brand new facility. So thank you again for being here. Yeah, this is great.